Welcome to the Western Baul podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled, Walking Side by Side with Grief for a Lifetime. The talk was given by Nachama Shahar on February 14th, 2026 via Zoom. Nachama is a physical therapist, editor, and musician who for 17 years was a member of the Shri blues band, which performed Western Baul music. In this presentation, she states that walking side by side with grief doesn't mean that we live a life without joy. It's to live with the bittersweet truth of impermanence. She notes that sorrow is one of the earth's great cycles, and that grief's shattering quality can be a doorway to our true nature, which puts us in touch with such deep feeling and can awaken us to love. Nachama discusses the 5 gates of grief identified by therapist and writer Frances Weller. She considers the works of authors Michael Meade, Joseph Campbell, and Susan Cain, poets Andrea Gibson, David White, and Judah Halevi, Zen teacher Henry Shukman, and Rabbi and Jungian therapist Tirza Firestone. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Nachama Shahar.
I want to welcome you to the talk this evening, which is Walking Side by Side with Grief for a Lifetime. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, I have to say, and maybe that's true for some of you as well. So about 4 years ago, I did a topic on grief and love, and I was moved to speak about it because of events in my life at that time, particularly the loss of people that I loved. And now, 4 years later, I'm cycling back around to the same thing. Have you ever noticed how we do that? That we cycle through something, but we don't necessarily leave it behind? We return to it, we come back around to it, but it's not a repetition. It's not a repeating of what happened in the past. There's something new and different that we can bring to the table because there is something new and different about us. And the reason for that is because we move through these cycles of death and rebirth for the entirety of our lives. So when we come back around to something, whatever it is, whether it's a theme or consideration, what's new is that, for one thing, we've lived more years. Maybe we're wiser because we've come to understand something about the nature of truth or reality that we hadn't before. We've probably cried more tears. Perhaps we've lived through another loss if we're talking about grief. Or maybe we feel the need to protest the heart-wrenching injustices we see in the world now. Grief can also be a form of protest where what is happening to our planet is unacceptable. And so when we take to the streets and we protest together, we are creating a container for our grief with each other. Grief always needs a container to hold it. That's one of the things about grief. It needs a container to hold it so we don't feel like there's no bottom and we're just falling through and drowning, which can be terrifying. So I've sat at my desk most of the day today because I attended an online seminar called Original Love, given by 2 Buddhist teachers. And one of the speakers read a few lines by Leonard Cohen from one of his songs. And I loved it so much that I wrote it down and I want to read it to you. This is from The Genius of Leonard Cohen. I greet you from the other side of sorrow and despair with a love so vast and shattered, it will reach you everywhere. So there's a few people who shape both the content and context of this talk, and I want to acknowledge them tonight and hopefully bring that inspiration into this talk. There is my sister, who lost her first grandchild last September to cancer at 7 months. And this was a baby who hardly ever left the hospital. And in the midst of her grieving, she called me one day, and through her tears, she said, "I think I understand what unconditional love is now." So for her, being shattered by grief became a doorway to the experience of a boundless love without conditions. And that is the possibility of grief. And we'll be talking about that more throughout the evening. The second is Francis Weller, who's a psychotherapist, writer, and he leads grief ceremonies all over the country. His ideas will be threaded throughout this entire talk. And then there's the poet, Andrea Gibson. Some of you may have heard of Andrea, who was a queer, non-binary poet and who was named the Poet Laureate of the state of Colorado a few years ago. And they passed away last year from ovarian cancer at age 49. I will read one of their poems at the end, which is a very powerful poem about love and grief. When they got their diagnosis of terminal cancer, they had a transformational experience where, in their words, they felt cherished and loved by the universe, and they understood immediately that everything that happened to them was for their benefit, for their spiritual evolution, including their cancer diagnosis and eventual death. And they were transported to a state of love that never left them and which informed the rest of their life and their poetry. They said, "Love is everything. I don't know if anything else exists. Love and truth are the exact same things." And then finally, there's the reality of what is happening in our world and the accelerated upheaval and breakdown that we are witnessing on a daily basis as we're watching the world stage changing rapidly and our democracy in this country being threatened and undermined. Literally, our country, our world will never be the same. And dealing with the heartbreak, the outrage, and the sorrow of that, and trying to digest what often seems overwhelming, is also part of what moved me to want to talk about this topic as well. So, what does it mean to live side by side with grief for a lifetime? What it doesn't mean is that we're condemned to a life of depression and melancholy, where we're resigned to not having joy in our lives, where we feel deflated and numb and contracted and flattened. That is not what this talk is about. And in fact, it's actually about the opposite. So depression, although not always, can arise because of unexpressed grief, that our grief has been pushed down and congested, and it hasn't been allowed to flow. When we don't grieve, we shut down, we turn away, and our hearts close. Moving grief or attending to grief is like unfreezing water, where it thaws and it flows and moves. A psychotherapist observed that his clients who came to see him complaining of depression were oftentimes suffering from chronic undigested grief and the inability to express it, that that's what was underneath the depression. So there's an alchemical principle that states that the material in a vessel must be kept warm in order for it to move and flow. When it's cold, it congeals and hardens and cannot move. This is what happens to us if we do not let our grief flow through us. There's a beautiful quote by Joseph Campbell where he wisely says, "We cannot cure the world of sorrows, but we can choose to live in joy." When we do not allow our grief to be expressed, our horizon narrows and our capacity to participate joyfully in the world diminishes. It impedes our ability to say yes to life, and so we turn away and we shut down. Francis Weller talks about how when we avoid grief and suffering, we're living our lives in what he calls the shallow end of the pool, and that the true invitation for a human being is full participation, the stepping into deep waters where we live creatively, abundantly, vulnerably, and with curiosity. It's in the deep waters where we live in intimacy with the 10,000 things. And it's in those deep waters where our grief lives side by side with our love, not at the shallow end of the pool, but in the depths of our humanity and our human experience. To walk side by side with grief is to live with the bittersweet, visceral truth of impermanence. And because of that, grief is never far away. It's not only when we've lost someone we love. It can be when we're taking a walk during autumn and we see the leaves falling from the trees, where they go from the full glory of their green foliage to branches that are naked and bare. It can be when the seasons change, the way summer fades into fall and fall into winter. The poignancy of impermanence can hit us when we watch the light change from full direct sun to the liminal time of dusk and its transformation into night, when all light leaves the sky and the sky becomes as black as coal and threaded with stars. This constant state of impermanence evokes a feeling of tenderness for the fragility of life. And in doing so, it puts us in touch with our longing for our true home, our longing for the divine, our longing for something that we yearn for in the depths of our souls, but maybe we can't quite articulate it. And yet it lives in us and it's deeply felt. So longing and grief and impermanence are intimately and inextricably woven together. They are threads of the same cloth, and they form a garment that we wrap around our shoulders and wear throughout our lives as embodied human beings. The writer Susan Cain says, living in a bittersweet state with an intense awareness of life's fragility and the pain of separation is an underappreciated strength and an unexpected path to wisdom, joy, and especially communion. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this talk, as I said earlier, is because of the extraordinary and dark times of collapse that we're living through. We're living through a crisis on a world level, psychologically, economically, and socially. Francis Weller calls these times the long dark, and this is what he says. We have been on an ascension run for 3,000 or 4,000 years, trying to rise above, to control and dominate, to master the planet and each other to some degree. The soul of the world, the anima mundi, is now taking us down. We're headed towards a long period of descent into the underworld. It's not a time of confidence and rising and ease and growth. We are in a decline, the negredo, the blackening, the darkening. This is a holy time when things decay, break down, and break apart. So we can ask the question, what is holy about a time when things decay, break down, and break apart? If we look at it from the archetypal perspective, there's always something holy about a time when there is a darkening and a descending to the underworld, when we're brought to our knees rather than the more comfortable direction of rising above and being in control. When we allow our grief about that to flow, there's a medicine that's released. Our gifts are called forth from us. So there's this idea that we each have medicine within us. And as mythologist Michael Meade says, we are the medicine that we are seeking. So we each have to find our own way to respond so that this medicine can rise to the surface. This is a quote from Michael Meade. He says, "In the midst of crisis, the soul tries to become conscious. This is true not only in an individual life, but in the drama of the world. The process of the soul becoming conscious is awakening to our own unique gifts and calling." Susan Cain, in her book, Bittersweet, talks about the power of transforming our grief and our suffering into beauty. She writes, "By acknowledging our pain, we attempt to turn it into art, the way musicians do, or healing or innovation or anything else that nourishes the soul. If we don't transform our sorrows and longings, we can end up inflicting them on others via abuse, domination, and neglect. But if we realize that all humans know or will know loss and suffering, we can turn towards each other. So what is holy in this time of the long dark, when there is descent and breakdown and decay, is that if we allow ourselves to go there, if we allow ourselves to feel the grief of what is being lost, for the greed and the overreaching of power, the cruelties and absence of empathy and humanity, the abject disregard for the earth and the environment, all that we are witnessing on a daily basis, if we allow ourselves to feel the grief of our disconnection with the sacred, with nature, and with beauty, that grief will wash us clean and it will deepen and ripen our being. And in that process, what will rise up, what will be called forth, is our unique medicine or our unique gifts that we can offer as service to the world, to our families, and to our communities. We all have something to offer, every single one of us. It could be gardening, cooking, caring for our pets, raising a child, singing, praying, chanting, artistic expression, social protest. So what I'm saying is, I don't think that what we are called to do is to collapse, to succumb to being steamrolled and overwhelmed and deflated by it all. I think we're called in these times to rise up, meaning that we're called to bring forth our gifts, our offering to our communities, to our friends, and to the world. Here's a quote by environmentalist and activist Kathleen Dean Moore. "Sorrow is part of the earth's great cycles, flowing into the night like cool air sinking down a river course. To feel sorrow is to float on the pulse of the earth, the surge from living to dying, from coming into being to ceasing to exist. Maybe this is why the earth has the power over time to wash sorrow into a deeper pool, cold and shadowed. And maybe this is why, even though sorrow never disappears, it can make a deeper connection to the currents of life, and so connect somehow to sources of wonder and solace." Okay, so next I want to talk about something from Francis Weller called the 5 Gates of Grief. And I want to go through each one of them individually. But before I do that, I just want to check in with everybody and see if you have any comments or thoughts or anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah, you were talking about protesting in the streets as an expression of grief. But I don't see that. I see anger and frustration because I don't think most people are in touch with their grief. So it shows up that way. And I was thinking, what would protesting in the street look like if people were actually in touch with grief? And I was thinking, it could look like people wailing and crying and weeping, that kind of thing. Can you imagine 10,000 people weeping in the streets instead of fighting?
Yeah. Did any of you follow the 20 monks who walked 2,300 miles from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C.? It was 109 days. There were always people that followed them. Yeah. There were always people that came to greet them and people that drove for hours that were not along their route, but wanted to receive their blessings and to hear their message of peace. No politics, nothing, no preaching, no criticism, just the importance of peace as kind of a revolution of love. And they walk through bitter cold. Some of them were walking barefoot and all kinds of weather. One man, this was in the very beginning, he got hit by a car as they were walking, and he ended up having to have his leg amputated. And at the end, he rejoined the other monks and he was in his wheelchair with his leg bandaged. And if you watch the people who came to see them, most of them were weeping. They were weeping not just from grief, but they were weeping from the beauty and the gratitude to having this group of monks. They ate once a day. They relied on other people to provide hospitality and feed them. And people were weeping. Thousands of people were weeping. So I think that's an example of what you're talking about. And I think that there was an element of grief because so many people are full of sorrow and deeply distressed about the divisiveness and polarization and the hatred and the cruelty and all of that. So that's what I would add to what you're saying. And, having participated in some protests, I can say that there is definitely anger there. But I think underneath, there's also grief. It just isn't shown. It's not expressed.
I feel deprived. I don't believe I've ever felt grief, which I think is sadness for a loss. I feel trauma. I feel trauma on a daily basis, a woundedness based on injury. And that's what I feel almost all the time about the things that you're talking about, what's happening with our world, etc. I think sadness and grief is a much more refined reaction. Wouldn't know how to get there.
Well, first I have to thank you for your vulnerability. It's brave to be able to say that, and it reflects a capacity for real self-honesty. And I think you're not alone. Having lost some people that I deeply loved a few years ago, which is what I said, that's what moved me to give the first talk. But a part of what moved me this time is just some of the trauma work that I've been doing, like the somatic trauma work that works through the body, and how it's helped me to get in touch with levels of grief in the body and nervous system that's been held there for so many years. And to be able to access that and to feel it has been very, very powerful. So there was a lot of grief that I had dismissed, particularly relating to trauma. I just turned a blind eye, or I did other things and stayed busy. But if you're able to say that, I feel like that's huge. So thank you for sharing that.
I don't think that I really experienced grief for 65 years. And it really came down to a personal loss that showed me something that I didn't even knew was there. To me, that has impacted me much more than grief for the world, just the personal aspect of that. I mean, that's just my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot about what's going on in the world, but it's different for me when it's personal. And I've realized that a lot of the way that I might have dealt with that, any other things that came up that had grief attached to it, like the loss of my brother years ago, I tended to push that away very unconsciously, didn't even know I was doing it. But then I look in my family and I see how my family, my parents dealt with things by holding it in and shielding themselves. I took that all in. And then I might have overlaid it with dharma, whatever the experience was. Seeing what happened, whatever loss I had experienced before this most recent one that really put me in touch with it, dealing with that by looking at it through the lens of the dharma, which I think can be useful, but it was more of a shield, I think. So what I'm finding is that there's a vulnerability to that. I just feel way more in touch with feelings, more on the surface all the time. I mean, a lot of the time. I wasn't having that kind of thing go on before.
I did want to say that using the Dharma as a shield is something that I feel like is common in spiritual circles and sometimes in spiritual communities. And for me, I can say personally that the spiritual principles of the Dharma were up here. They were lofty. And I really stayed in that lofty realm for a long time. And it's not that there's no value in that. It's intoxicating in some ways to do that. But to come down into the body, into the nervous system, to actually feel what I would not allow myself to feel before has opened up a whole new vista into the Dharma. It's not like the Dharma's not there because I'm doing something else. The Dharma is there more so than even before, but it's the Dharma that lives in the body and not just in the mind. That's what it's been for me, and I think it's a good point. So I would like to continue and talk about the 5 gates of grief. So the 5 gates of grief, this is from Francis Weller. And we think of grief primarily as being the loss of someone or something that we love, but it's much more than that. And the 5 gates of grief expand our understanding of what grief actually encompasses. They're doorways that help us understand these different kinds of loss. The first gate is the one that we are most familiar with in this culture, which is when we lose someone we love. But there's 4 other gates that don't receive nearly as much attention, meaning that the grief that accumulates at these other gates is not as recognized in our culture as much as this first gate. And what's not recognized tends to get pushed down. And we carry the weight of these unrecognized sorrows that have not been grieved. It's interesting that it's been that way for years, but the number 1 cause of death in the US is heart disease, congestive heart failure. So we can speculate that perhaps it's not always just due to high cholesterol and plaque buildup, but that actually our hearts are burdened by undigested sorrow, that we have broken hearts that we haven't attended to. So by understanding the grief that is held at these gates, we might be able to begin to honor it, to compassionately meet it and allow its expression. And really, I could spend an entire talk on each of these gates. But for tonight's talk, I want to just introduce them to you so you get an idea of the fuller, broader spectrum of what grief encompasses. Every one of us has grief at each of these gates. And as we go through them, you might recognize some of them within yourself. So the first gate, which is the one that we're most familiar with, is that everything we love, we will lose. And there's the 12th century poem by the Spanish Jewish poet Judah Halevi, who writes, "It's a holy thing to love what death can touch." And the key idea is that to love what death touches, what death will inevitably and always touch without exception, is holy. When we grieve, we're praising the one we loved and how we allowed their love to touch the core of our being, and to let love, any love of anyone or anything, touch the core of our being is very powerful, and it is sacred. Zen teacher and poet Henry Shukman said, "When somebody's faced with a grievous loss, if one fully surrenders to it, it can be like another searing face of love. Grief seems unbearable. It's beyond what one can navigate. One is outside what the self knows, beyond what the self has constructed in its understanding of things. It's something greater, larger, timeless, dimensionless, outside of the reality we know. In this sense, it's analogous to awakening." And I think that this is a brilliant quote. The way that he made the connection between the unbearable grief of losing someone we love and the experience of awakening to our true nature, which is that we are inseparable from creation. And with both, there's a shattering of the familiar, the predictable, the framework of reality that we had identified with. And so we're interfacing with something much larger that is outside of this known reality. So he's making this analogy between awakening to our unitive state and to grief, the grief of unbearable loss. And hopefully there will be time, but towards the end of the evening, I'd be talking more about it. So that's the first gate. The second gate is the places that have not known love. This gate is about the grief of those places within ourselves that have not been loved, the places that are full of self-hatred, of worthlessness, and shame. They're connected to our experiences of childhood trauma, where trauma has eaten away at our self-worth, where we were shamed, not valued, not loved, where we couldn't have our own voice. And because of this, those places are often banished to the nether regions of our psyches, where we keep them in the shadowy darkness and we treat them as outcasts. There are whole portions of our life we have turned away from, where we've learned to settle for less, where we're resigned to a life of smallness, where we've adapted and compromised and betrayed ourselves over and over, where our life force has been dulled and we spiral into worthlessness, into resignation. So these outcast parts of ourselves, they show up as addictions, as depression, as anxiety, as despair. From an Indigenous perspective, the grief we experience at this gate is a kind of soul loss, which occurs when the feeling of being alive becomes diminished. So our horizon narrows and we cannot open to experiencing awe and wonder. It's when our life force and our vital energy becomes compromised and we become increasingly despondent, despairing, numb, and depressed. Traditional people say that this is the most dangerous condition a human being can experience, the soul loss. So to start to heal that, we want to have compassion for ourselves and be able to weep for those places that we have banished and hidden in shame. So the work in this gate is to bring those rejected parts of ourselves back from the shadows, where we stop hiding them in the darkness, and to develop self-love so we can call them back into being and give them a voice. The poet Andrea Gibson says, in describing their transformational experience that I spoke of earlier, upon hearing their diagnosis of terminal cancer, said, I felt this intense, deep sense of loving myself. Self-love is loving the whole world. Those things just go hand in hand. This is a stanza from a poem by David White from his poem called Coleman's Bed. Be taught now among the trees and rocks how the discarded is woven into shelter. Learn the way things hidden and unspoken slowly proclaim their voice in the world. Find that inward symmetry to all outward appearances. Apprentice yourself to yourself. Begin to welcome back all you sent away. Be a new annunciation. Make yourself a door through which to be hospitable, even to the stranger in you. So in this poem, in this stanza, the poet, he's beckoning us, he's inviting us to welcome back all the parts of ourselves that we've sent away. The parts that are fragmented, split off, the parts that are hidden and unspoken. This is a holy task, to apprentice ourselves to ourselves, to know all of who we are and to welcome ourselves home. I cannot emphasize how important this is, not just for our own healing, but for the healing of our family lineage. And perhaps we can stretch and say for the whole world. This is where it begins. And this is my experience, to call all parts of ourselves home. That's the second gate. The third gate is the sorrows of the world. The third gate of grief is when we go beyond ourselves and we open to the losses of the world around us and our sadness about the earth as our mother. It's the gate where we experience the soul of the world, or the anima mundi. So this is a gate where we feel the losses from the devastating effects of climate change, the loss of indigenous languages and cultures, the loss of rainforests, the loss of species, the genocide and famine in Palestine and Sudan, the way immigrants are being treated and shoved into detention centers, flown to countries far from their native country where they have no family. Is when we feel the loss of the land that's been scarred by forest fires, the loss of homes, of thousands upon thousands of people who die from climate-related tsunami and floods and hurricanes. Francis Weller writes, what if, however, the feelings we have when we pass through these zones of destruction are actually arising from the land itself? What if it is the grief of the forest registering in our bodies and psyches? What if we are not separate from the world at all? It is our spiritual responsibility to acknowledge these losses. What if it is the soul of the world that is weeping through us? We know and feel in our bones that something primal is amiss. Our extended home is being eroded, as is the experience of our wider self. It is good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology at these places touched by so much loss. To live a life of soul means living with sensitivity to the plight of the planet. The fourth gate, what we expected and did not receive. This gate is harder to identify and it's more obscure because it's about things that we may not have even realized that we've lost. And what we've lost is actually our inheritance and it's our birthright as human beings. So there are these archetypal and ancestral imprints that are coded into our psyches that are about the container of the village. So the rituals, the celebration, the songs and stories that are a part of village life. Quote, "We are born expecting a rich and sensuous relationship with the earth and communal rituals of celebration, grief, and healing that keep us in connection with the sacred. But that's not what we are born into in the modern world." So in this gate, the absence of this haunts us, even if we can't put our finger on it and articulate it. And it leads to feelings of alienation, aloneness, loneliness, not knowing where we belong in our modern society, because this deep need to belong is often not met. And our culture is full of this emptiness, particularly, I want to say, white Western culture, this disconnection from beauty, from the village, and from the sacred. Everything in modernity is about self-sufficiency, control, competition, and domination. It's about individual achievement. So you can see the contrast between what is valued in the modern world and this DNA encoded imprint of what our long ago ancestors knew and lived, and yet it still lives inside of us as a whisper, an imprint, and a longing. That's the fourth gate. And the last gate, the fifth gate, is the gate of ancestral grief. This is the grief that we carry in our bodies from our ancestors for generations. It could be a history of rape and sexual abuse in the family. It could be a suicide from generations past that's carried as a wound. It could be alcoholism or some kind of addiction passed down from one generation to the next. Oftentimes, these are associated with shame, and they stay hidden in the shadows where they're not faced, but turned away from. And people live from generation to generation in denial. And yet we pass them down from one generation to the next. An example of that is a story I read about a young man who was carrying the sense of shame, and he couldn't shake it, and he couldn't figure out what it was. And he finally went to see a therapist for some help. And they were talking about it, and the therapist asked him one day if there were any stories about his grandparents or parents that might be contributing to his feelings of shame. And he couldn't think of anything. And then one day he remembered his grandfather's alcoholism, and he never met his grandfather. And the family didn't really talk about him. And so he began to realize through the help of this therapist that the shame he was carrying did not belong to him, but to his family, and the shame that they carried about the grandfather and the alcoholism. So when we tend to this ancestral grief, or we can call it intergenerational grief, and the ways in which we carry it, it heals not only us as individuals, but it heals the family lineage because it stops being passed down. And there's the ancestral grief of families, but there's also the collective abuse of large groups of people and cultures. In this ancestral grief, there's the grief of the genocide of indigenous cultures and the stealing of their land all over the world. There's the Holocaust, the bringing over of slaves from Africa, and the deplorable legacy of slavery in this country as some examples. We carry these in our psyches, and the grief from these atrocities is huge. It's enormous. There's a woman, her name is Dr. Rabbi Tirza Firestone, and she's a Jungian therapist, and she's a rabbi. And she wrote a book on healing the wounds of ancestral trauma. And she clarifies the ancestral trauma. She makes the distinction between the trauma of families and then the ancestral trauma of whole ethnicities and groups of people and communities. So she writes, ancestral traumas are the unworked legacies of those who have died. This might include unresolved life stories, secrets, resentments, or other injuries that never had a chance to heal. These unprocessed life stresses can influence future generations in the form of inherited tendencies to similar kinds of stress, anxiety, and psycho-emotional issues. Historical trauma is the residue of extreme life circumstances that occur that continue to affect not only individuals, but entire groups, ethnicities, communities, and entire nations. All lineages carry ancestral wounds. Those who colonized others bear great moral wounds. The human pain incurred by their misdeeds is a legacy that continues for generations. Likewise, those who were colonized, enslaved, or murdered bear wounds that reverberate intergenerationally. So, those are the 5 gates. And I actually want to pause and have everybody just take a breath, please. There's a lot of information here, I realize, and I want to give all of us a minute or so to just pause and digest. And if you're moved, if you can relate to any of these other gates at all, please feel free to share if you'd like.
What's the remedy?
The remedy for what?
Grief.
Well, that's the next part of the talk.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. That's a lead-in. I mean, really, the remedy for grief is just to feel it, to allow it to move through us, to keep it liquid and fluid and moving and warm and attended to. That is a lot in and of itself, because we are not a grief literate culture. As a matter of fact, we're grief phobic. And yes, there's been some improvement, but still, this culture is a very grief phobic culture. So just beginning knowing that you don't feel grief is, I think, part of the remedy, is just to know that about yourself.
So when you say grief phobic, of course, death phobic comes to mind, and to our society is so profoundly death phobic, extremely painful for me. These griefs that you mentioned, these 5 sorts of griefs, I can very much identify with them. And I asked myself for years, okay, prove to me that you have grief. Come on, let's see some tears. Let's see some action. And that's not really the way it works. But having gone through grief number 1 big time, there was this welling of sadness and wonder that was so powerful, having a taste of grief. And I think that it's very constructive to be able to think of some of the other griefs. We have a very good protest in Paris, a silent protest where we just walk in a circle for 20 minutes to protest the Palestinian massacre. We don't do anything, and it's very dignified. Each time that I do it, I hold a picture of a child. They have a wide selection of things to hold. And so the child that's been murdered speaks to me much more and lets me feel grief personified. Feeling grief for the destruction of the world, perhaps it's one of the easiest. Those who have any appreciation of nature, of life, and you go out and you see it's been devastated, you can feel outrage, but tremendous sadness and grief, I think, come very naturally. You've made me think about how each one of these might manifest itself in me.
I've been sick for weeks and weeks and weeks with a lung condition. My friends were saying, well, just go to the doctor and get some steroids and antibiotics. But I had this intuition that there's something deeper going on in terms of my own grief. And to this idea of dharmic overlay and not experiencing grief, I realized that I am experiencing grief so deeply, but I'm not recognizing that I am grief. And so, related to the dharmic overlay, the deep insight of true nature and being absorbed in bliss, really, really, it's been a good medicine, but it's also prevented me from going deeper into who I really am as a human being.
You said it was your lungs?
Yes. And I have a basic knowledge to understand that the lungs are connected to that specific issue.
Yeah, they're associated with grief. That's my understanding.
So, I haven't had this wish to just get out of it, but just to actually hang out with it and see what it has to show me.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that I'm being served by it, that there's something important happening.
Yeah, and I hope that you heal from this and feel better, and also at the same time keep your curiosity alive about what's happening for you.
Thank you for that.
Just a story about grief and my relationship to it. I was seeing at one point a physical therapist, and they were doing some cranial sacral work on me. Went to see him for something about my back. I'm having problems with my back. So he's doing this cranial sacral work on me, and he says, I'm picking up a lot of sadness in you. And I said, just fix my back. At that time, I was not interested in talking about it. Now, I'm still not interested in talking about it. It's not like a conversation piece for me. But what that also put me in touch with in that little interchange was what a constant it is. The grief, it's a constant. It's always there. It wasn't about anything in particular. It's just like a constant thread.
Constant threat. I think that's been my experience, to ward that off, again, unconsciously. Part of grieving for me, I don't know if this is just a personal thing or if it's generalized for everyone, but part of grieving for me involves sharing with others. It's not like, oh, I'm going to share and get support and hugs necessarily, but truly being authentic. I mean, it's not like I can do this. There's a right way of doing it or something. It just seems to happen. To me, if it's an insular process, I am still holding on. I really appreciate support. That's why there were grief support groups for people to, I think, get used to being open about what's happening inside them with others. There's something about bringing it out that has been really essential for me. Certainly not with everybody. It really has to be the right space, but that's been an important part of the process.
And that's what prevents it from getting frozen, like I was saying before. If you attend to it, especially with others, yourself and with others, if there's attention put on it, compassionate attention, and holding that space, then that grief flows and it doesn't get stuck. And it opens up the possibility of feeling everything, not indiscriminately, but to a deeper level of feeling, of joy and awe and wonder and all of that. It's like it opens the gate to feeling other things when we're stuck in grief and it's not digested and it's disregarded and dismissed. It holds back other feelings as well. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not let's just focus on grief without considering the possibility of grief. And that's the last part of what I want to talk about as well.
When you go to the bottom of the well, then you can come back up again.
That's right.
You also know that you can handle it. And that's what I wanted to make sure I didn't go near because it seemed too much.
First of all, I really appreciate hearing these different gates because there are a few of them that I very much relate to and had no idea that's what that was. But also that for me, there's something so delicious about grief in this much the same way as it is for me, death when it's happening. Not, oh, someday everybody's going to die. And the thing with the grief is like I feel so much more in touch with what's real and important and true. And I feel at the same time as it might be totally devastating, sobbing to no end, it's also just this sweetness. So grateful for being able to feel actually so deeply, and like gratitude for what is so beautiful that it would hurt so bad to lose it or to see the devastation of the planet and the animals that I love. It is so beautiful. It wouldn't hurt if it was just like these things aren't important anyway, but it puts me so much more in touch with what is actually real and important. And even though it really hurts, there's just this sweetness about it, even though it just hurts.
Yeah. You were saying that it's always there, and it's always there because impermanence is always there, always. It never takes a break, ever. And whether we know it consciously or we're thinking about it consciously, it's still, I think, something we feel viscerally, we sense, because we see it in the natural world. We see it in our beloved and our pets. Like I was saying earlier, we see it when the leaves are falling from the trees. There's like a natural, bittersweet, poignant, melancholy sense of, I call it longing, because to me, it's so connected with the longing that we feel. And I have a hard time being able to linearly describe what that longing is, but I feel it and I see it around me. And I think that grief is with us always. And I think that longing is with us at the same time, always. And it's like just being able to feel that deeply. You know, when we really turn away from grief for long periods of time, I really feel like we're doing a disservice, not just to ourselves, but to our friends, to our families, and to the world. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about grief again is because when I am in touch with it myself and I allow it to flow, my feeling for so many other things is deepened and enhanced. And there's beauty in that. So, looking at another facet of this topic, which is our capacity to love and the awakening to love through grief. And my intention for this talk was to speak about grief in some depth, including the 5 gates, but not to stop there. So, what I want to close with is this idea that because grief opens us like nothing else, it can actually be a portal or a doorway to the embodied realization of our true nature, that we are inseparable from the earth, from the universe, that we are actually connected to the circuitry of love that flows through everything in creation. And inherent in that connectivity is a quality of unconditional love, because everything at its source is infused with love. Some of you may know Nick Cave, musician and writer, and he lost 2 sons. And he wrote about the way that we are remade by grief. He says that through grief, everything seems so fragile and precious and heightened. So because grief has a shattering quality, the way it breaks us open, the way it takes us beyond what we think we can handle, the way it drops us to our knees and breaks down the reality we thought we knew into these unrecognizable pieces that just don't fit together anymore, that it can actually catapult us into the unitive state. Zen teacher and poet Henry Shukman, I read a quote of his before. He says that the most important thing about spiritual practice is the opening up to infinite love, which is available in every single moment. he writes, "There is nothing but love that is ready to give everything, constantly generous, constantly creating. Everything is made of love because it's pouring out of what can never be known. There is one empty, boundless generosity and love at the heart of things." So I want to make the very important point that this is the possibility of grief, that it can awaken us to love. And there's the personal love, where our love for other human beings deepen, that we become more tenderized towards everything in this world, towards nature, towards animals, the unsheltered people who live on the street. But it's also the possibility of awakening to the love that runs through the entire universe, and how we are a part of that circuitry of love. And in fact, that actually is our true belonging. Another quote by a poet, David White: "Love is never just human-centered, and even when centered on a person, opens up the bird song in the broad sky around them to new hearing, the branches of silhouetted trees to a new seeing, the breeze to a fresh, scintillating sensitivity on the skin. Love always wants to lead us back to its origin, the foundational embrace of creation." And I want to read a poem by Andrea Gibson. So this is from their poetry book, You Better Be Lightning, which I believe was their last book. And this poem is called The Last Hours. "We've been dating only 2 weeks when the phone rings in the middle of the night. I beg every light green on my way to her house, and the grief gods answer. When I reach her, she is curled up in the garden. The earth is under her nails, as if she's just discovered something that could have fed the whole world wasn't harvested in time. She says nothing for almost half an hour, then whispers, 'My grandpa died.' The moon flickers out like a candle. Our second date was a walk through a neighborhood where the porches were bigger than both of our homes combined. Does it thrill you or crush you to know no one inside is more grateful than us?" I would have asked if I hadn't known the answer. If the answer wasn't the reason I loved her already. Because that night was the first time my eyes weren't too shy to look directly at her face. I finally noticed the gap in her teeth on Mapleton Street, beside a house shaped like a wedding cake. My grandparents have been married for 63 years, she told me, and a door in the center of her smile opened to a tiny Midwest church in 1944. At the end of the aisle, 2 kids, too young to know anything, were promising each other everything. Now tonight, the simple garden is its own church, as she tells me about the last hours of her grandfather's life. He was in bed, she says. My grandma was sitting beside him, holding his hand. He said the word love. Then a few minutes later, he said it again, and he kept saying it, love, 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 over and over for hours. He said it for hours, then kissed my grandma goodbye. There are enough tears between us to pull a redwood tree out of a nettle seed or to water the garden beneath us for a century. 6 years from now, we will kiss for the last time. 7 years from now, we will take our first walk together as friends. 8 years from now, a bicycle accident will shatter her 2 front teeth, and I'll beg her not to let the dentist fill the gap. She won't listen, but the door to the church will stay open anyway. Each time she smiles, A bouquet of wildflowers will fly from her grandmother's 22-year-old hand and move through the air in slow motion, trying to find a way to land in the arms of the whole world. I've written so many poems in my life, and every single one of them was just trying to find a better way to say what one soul said to another soul with one word. Isn't it amazing that I came up so short? Isn't it everything that I tried so hard and failed to write a single thing more beautiful than love?
63 years that communicates something. I mean, it seems that we go on and walk side by side with grief when we've really experienced that. But as you said, it's not depressing. It's just a whole feeling relationship to life that has come to life.
Yes, that's right.
It's always been there, but just haven't touched it. And it doesn't seem to me like it's all the time, every second or anything, but it doesn't take much. Just a poem. Could be anything.
Yeah. It's like that first gate, anything or anyone that we've ever loved. You know, the poet said, to love what death can touch is holy. And that feels true to me. It's not a sentimental way of looking at it. It's very, very deep. It's being in the very, very heart of life, which includes death. Francis Weller says, living in the deep waters. If we live in the shallow end of the pool, we're kind of skirting the surface. But if we want to live abundantly with curiosity, vulnerably, so much of it is about vulnerability and tenderness. I know that for me, one of the things about grief is that it has really tenderized me, and I'm just more tender about so many things. And I love feeling that tenderness. I love the way it connects me to creation, to nature, to animals, to trees, to granite rocks, to water, to the infinite sky of the desert, all of it. There's just so much more connecting and belonging.
I think about some spiritual teachers, and I think that underlying their activity, they experience this. At least the ones that I've had some contact with, I feel like they've kind of come from that place, or they were in touch with that, even if it didn't look like that all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and grief doesn't necessarily look a certain way. It's not that we're falling on the ground and weeping all the time. Grief has a quiet voice too. And I don't think we're in the throes of grief all the time. I don't think that's what it means to walk side by side with grief. Grief is sometimes very, very internal. It's good to recognize there's different faces of grief. There's different gates of grief. And they're available to us, as is the possibility of connecting with and being with our true nature. That was really one of the points that I wanted to make. You know, the relationship between feeling grief and the awakening to who we really are, which is not separate. You can really say that that's what grief is about, to learn that we're not separate. We feel grief individually, but we're not separate. We belong to the divine. We belong to nature. We belong to creation. We belong to our families, to each other. There's such a profound sense of belonging. But we can't do it without going through the gates of grief.